We cry to God for help. God helps. End of story, right? Not quite. Actually, it's just the beginning. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas. And this is your daily devotional for Thursday, September 5th, 2024. Psalm 116 is a wonderful psalm from beginning to end. It is the joyful proclamation that the psalmist cried out to God for help, and God came through. The psalm begins, "I love the Lord because he has heard my voice and my supplications." If you've ever read through the Psalms, you know how many Psalms are cries to God for help. Very often the pattern goes something like this. The psalmist cries out to God for help or rescue from some enemies, usually unnamed. Psalm 7, for example, begins, "O Lord my God, in you I take refuge. Save me from all my pursuers, and deliver me, or like a lion they will tear me apart." That psalm continues with a litany of such requests, and finally in the last lines, the psalmist ends with words of confident assurance that the Lord will indeed act, even though he has not yet acted. He writes, "I will give to the Lord thanks due to his righteousness, and sing praise to the name of the Lord Most High." This is a typical pattern for these kinds of psalms. Always a cry for help, ending with words of confident assurance that in due time, God will come to the aid of the supplicant. Psalm 16, though, is a little different. It begins with a proclamation of what God has now already done for the supplicant. "You have delivered my soul from death, my eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling." And then the psalmist asks perhaps the most important question that we all need to ask from time to time. What shall I return to the Lord for all his bounty to me? The pattern of crying out to God for help, followed by God's rescue, is never the end of the story. For the faithful, it really is the beginning. In some parts of the church, salvation is the goal of faith. It's what people strive for all their lives. But for Reformed Christians like us, salvation, God's rescue, marks the beginning of faith and the life of faith. Everything from there is a response to God's mercy and grace. In the words of Psalm 116, answering the question of what to return to the Lord for God's mercy, it reads, "I will lift up the cup of salvation and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people. Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful ones. O Lord, I am your servant. I am your servant, the child of your serving girl. You have loosed my bonds. I will offer to you a thanksgiving sacrifice and call on the name of the Lord. I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people, in the courts of the house of the Lord. In your midst, O Jerusalem, praise the Lord." Now, this is poetic language. It doesn't fill in the blanks about how the psalmist will actually respond. The language, "I will lift up the cup of salvation, I will pay my vows to the Lord in the presence of all his people," is symbolic. Yes, it does point to the formal acts of making sacrifices and offerings in the temple, but really it points to a larger intention. Life now becomes the psalmist's means of giving thanks to God, not just once, but for all time. And that's the point for us, isn't it? God has done great things for us. God has accepted us as his own without regard to any intrinsic worth on our part. We call it grace because it is unearned, unmerited. God's merciful act of rescuing us is the beginning of our story and not the end, and it points us to a life of grateful service to God. Not just one or two symbolic acts, but a life lived as a living sacrifice every day. Tomorrow, the glory of being a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord. But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.